Good afternoon. My name is Nima Niksad. I'm a candidate here in the Department of Computer Science and Engineering, and I have the pleasure of introducing our next speaker, Dr. Fran Berman. Dr. Berman joined us in 1984 from Purdue University and served as the second director of the San Diego Supercomputer Center from 2001 until 2009. Dr. Berman was the first holder of the High Performance Computing Endowed Chair in the Jacobs School of Engineering, and has been at the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute since 2009. So without further ado, please help me welcome Dr. Berman.
I can't tell you what a thrill it is to be here. So exciting to be here to see all my fabulous colleagues and all the wonderful things the department has done. I have to tell you that as a UC person, I feel like I've had almost, a broad scope of jobs here. I was an undergraduate myself at UCLA. I was here as a professor and a supercomputer center director. I'm the mom, a proud mom of a UCSD graduate. So I feel like I've done just about everything but work in the cafeteria, so this is really a thrill to be back. Today I wanted to talk to you about, arguably one of the most exciting topics of our time. Which is digital data and the way it drives innovation and just about everything else in our world. So let's get started. As we all know, it's a data-driven world. In the supercomputing and computing world, we're going for exabytes. In the data world, we're in the, exaflops. In the data world, we're already in the zettabytes arena. So there's a mass of data. It drives what we do in our real lives. We shop online, we entertain ourselves online, we communicate with our friends and family online. Our research is part of what we're doing that's data-driven as well. Our health is data-driven, our physical infrastructure is data-driven. What you see is a fantastic visualization here done by San Diego Supercomputer Center people and their colleagues about seismic waves coming down the lower San Andreas fault and kind of obliterating Los Angeles. So, these are the kinds of things that you need because, for example, if you're in Los Angeles and the big one comes, you want to plan. You want to plan in terms of building structures. You want to plan in terms of disaster response, et cetera. So the kind of work that we do that's data-driven is incredibly important. As I said before, nowhere is this as important as it is in the research environment. So no matter what question you want to look at, what is the likely impact of a large-scale earthquake? How does disease spread in urban populations? How can we increase wheat yields for agricultural productivity or to look at sort of issues of hunger? All of these are data-driven questions. So these days, how we handle data, the ecosystem around infrastructure and data, our policy, our practice, our social infrastructure, the vision of sort of how data is going to impact our world is of great interest to us. And all you have to do is open up the newspaper and you see data-related articles all the time. Now, one of the things I want to deal with in this talk is what's required to support data-driven innovation. I'm going to give you kind of a wide variety of things. So let's just start by sort of thinking about data as an ecosystem. If you think about an ecosystem, you have resources, you have infrastructure, you have a way to manage those resources. For us in the data world, you can kind of think of our natural resources, the data collections, et cetera. You can think of infrastructure as the software and hardware tools and systems and infrastructure, that we use, data centers, et cetera. But there's also sort of a social and organizational spin on it. What kind of policy, what kind of practice? How do we involve people in data? What kinds of standards do we need? And it's really important to think about those things. And we're going to spend a lot of time talking about the social infrastructure around the data ecosystem. There's also resource management. If you think about it, your data has to live someplace. You want to give it a stable home, and somebody's going to have to pay the mortgage for that home. So you have to think about data stewardship. You have to think about the sustainability of our most valuable data, its economic support, et cetera. So let's start with an example. And let's start with the example of data-driven health. So say you want to ask the question, who is at risk for asthma? Now, most of us, in fact, probably all of us, know someone or know of someone who has asthma, and it may be more or less of a serious thing for them. It's a major cause of disability, health resource utilization, poor quality of life, and sometimes death worldwide. It is the most chronic disease among children and young adults. And the estimates are that within the next decade or so, about 400 million people worldwide will have asthma. So it turns out that asthma is not just something we should look at from a health perspective. It's actually a socio-cultural health issue. So if you think about asthma, you might be thinking about air quality. You might be thinking about where is the location of the physical infrastructure, factories, hospitals, et cetera. And you might think about sort of all those things in terms of how you deal with asthma as a problem. So here's some examples of results of a community that's looked at asthma. First of all, when you think of asthma risk factors, and we mine the data, you know, it's pretty clear that pollution and smoking matter. Turns out that age matters. Children are much more likely to get asthma than adults. And there's things you might not expect. It turns out that there's a correlation between asthma and allergies to cockroaches and dust mites, exposure to formaldehyde, and a number of other things that may not be so expected. The World Health Organization did a study of asthma. It turns out that some countries have a much higher risk for asthma than others. Australia is the highest, Vietnam is among the lowest. So it turns out that all of this data involved in asthma is very important for us, A, in terms of understanding the disease and treating the disease, but also in terms of asthma as a public health issue. Because if you think about lost days of work, you know, death, disability, poor quality of life, asthma makes a big difference. So let's look at this, this article, The Impact of a Program for Control of Asthma in a Low-Income Setting, a little bit and see what's the data backstory. So this is an interesting article. It's certainly accessible to those of us who are not healthcare professionals or biologists. And what it talks about is a program for the control of asthma that was able to, through education, through some medication, through kind of early prevention of severe asthma attacks, it was able to decrease costs for asthma treatment in low-income families. And if you're a low-income family and you look at the amount of money you're paying for those hospital costs or for other kinds of severe intervention things, that makes a big deal. What kind of data did they use to sort of create this public health activity? First of all, they looked at the public health data itself. They looked at personal data around the patients. There was age and gender. What does asthma cost for families? What about the quality of life? They looked at pharmacy data, you know, who goes to the pharmacy and buys asthma medication when, who goes into the hospital and how often, et cetera. And if you think about, from a computer science perspective, what you have to do to get this data together, somebody's got to write a lot of infrastructure. Somebody's got to make sure that when you get the GPS information from air quality, you can align that with the address that you have in one database or with the way of referring to where the site is in another data collection, that you can look at the economic factors and then associate that with the name that you have on the patient list versus, say, the population census information. So all of that stuff is code. And you have people sort of writing those translational programs so you can start mining this data. It turns out that this is not just true for asthma, it's true everywhere. So when you're looking at some of the more interesting problems, they all have sort of data sharing and exchange behind them. You know, we see it, you know, every time you open the newspaper, we see it for the Alzheimer's community, the autism community, where the NIH created policy asking people to put their data in the same kinds of data collection. The astronomers have agreed to share their data, which mean they had to come to agreement about common metadata standards, et cetera, you know, in all kinds of things. So data sharing and exchange and the infrastructure that supports it is tremendously important. So what I want to talk about for a while is the research data sharing ecosystem. And I chose this graphic for this in a particular way, because if you think about what you're building, when you're building infrastructure to answer a question like the asthma question, you know, it's like constructing a house. You're constructing it, you have all kinds of different systems. Some people will live in that house, although everybody will not live in that house. You have to coordinate plumbers and electricians and drywall people, etc. And it all has to kind of work to make an integrated whole. And in some sense, our infrastructure must work in that way as well. All infrastructure doesn't have to work for all people and all problems. But for every particular problem, we want to have some substantive infrastructure that makes things easy, like to live in the house. So let's start thinking about data from birth to death or immortality, no matter where you go. And so the first thing we want to do when we start thinking about data and its life cycle is we want to create data. And it turns out that you can create data from a large variety of things. From the Large Hadron Collider, you might get data from there for physics. You might be creating it from your digital camera. You might be creating it from a telescope or from sensors or from your lab experiments, etc. Then you kind of want to ready it to be used with other data of its type. So you might be organizing it, annotating it, attaching metadata to it, cleaning it, filtering it, etc. Then, most important for the scientific community, you want to use and reuse it. You want to be able to replicate your results. You want to have data in a place and that's valued so that you can do that. So you want to analyze it, mine it, derive additional data like the movie I just showed from my SDSC friends at the top of the talk. You want to visualize it, etc. Then you want to publish it and disseminate it. And we're going to talk a little bit about publishing data and making it accessible to the public, which is something that the White House has been extremely interested about this year in particular. But when we talk about publishing data, we don't just talk about publications. We're talking about portals. We're talking about making it accessible to your colleagues and other people who might want to see it, etc. And then at the beginning or the middle or the end of the data's life, you have to think about, really what, and you really have to think about this all the way through, is it valuable data that we want to be looking at in the future? If that's true, we need to store and preserve it in some way. If we really care about it, we're going to replicate it in multiple different places. If you think about the Byzantine generals problem, it says that you need at least 3 places, and in some instances 7 places to keep your data safe. Maybe we store it and ignore it, and it just sort of falls off our hard drive when our hard drive crashes, or maybe we want to destroy it. But in any case, whether we do that in an explicit way or whether we just let things happen, your data's life will depend on it. Now, if you think about data infrastructure, that's an enabler for all the data-driven research we do, whether we're kind of looking at, future moonshots or modeling of the world, or looking at viruses take over the world. I forget whether Casey or Stefan gave me this great graphic, or whether you're looking for biology and life sciences. And typically we talk about data access and data sharing, data visualization, these kinds of things. But again, there's a lot of infrastructure building blocks underneath that. So in order for me to do data visualization or data sharing, data analysis, I need to have data mining algorithms. I need to have some practice in my community around data sharing. I need to have agreed on common metadata standards. I need to be able to find my data. How do I discover it, etc. So, I need to have a way of citing my data. And there's a sort of a big focus worldwide on data citation standards these days. So all of those pieces of infrastructure are absolutely critical for me to be able to use my data in a particularly reasonable way. Now, I have to say that UCSD has been a real pioneer in this area, and my apologies to everyone who did not get on the slide. I was talking to Casey today from CADA, and CADA should definitely, like a lot of other things, be on this slide. But SDSC and UCSD have really a history of leadership in data infrastructure that started from when Sid was director, continued through my watch. It certainly continues through Mike Norman as director of SDSC these days. And there were a lot of really pioneering projects that people did at SDSC. Reagan Moore and all of the activities he did around SRB and IRODS, Triton Baru and all the wonderful work he did around applications on GEONT, for data for geoscientists. NEAS was data for earthquake engineers. Safe and Well was data in a data portal for disaster response. Phil Bourne and all of the Protein Data Bank crew that's hosted here at SDSC. It's a worldwide valuable data collection. Natasha Bollock had one of the first open general data repositories for the community. And we had Data Central, sometime in the 2000s, we had over 100 different community data collections that were stored at SDSC. I was very involved as co-chair of the Blue Ribbon Task Force on Sustainable Digital Preservation and Access for a few years, really looking at the issue of data economics, which we'll talk about a little bit more. Brian Schottlander over at the UCSD Libraries, who's a real pioneer in the digital data space and for the library world, and David Miner and others at SDSC. And of course, supercomputers that could deal with data-intensive problems. And if you look at a long history of SDSC machines, they've really been created and configured to handle the data activities very, very well, and SDSC has been a pioneer in this. So this is something that through Cal IT Squared, through SDSC, through the Computer Science Department, and through researchers all over the UCSD campus, we can justifiably be really, really proud of this space, and I hope my UCSD colleagues and friends market it like crazy. Let me tell you a little bit about what we learned about data stewardship at SDSC. Certainly what I learned on my watch as director is really that you can't legitimately talk about data infrastructure without thinking about economics. These things cost money. It's just like the water doesn't come to your house for free, the lights don't stay on at Cal IT Squared for free, somebody's paying the Wi-Fi bill, so all of these kinds of infrastructure that we come to depend on to do everything we do costs money. Maintenance and upkeep, reporting costs, networking, utilities, et cetera. And if you think about our storage growth in this 10-year period from 97 to 99, where the storage at SDSC kept going up, 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 you see that sort of red line tells you how we had to stay on top of it. Because as the user community kept wanting to put more and more data at SDSC, we needed to have the room, whether it was tape or disk or in other ways, to do it. And all of those things cost money. So when we provided a free repository for the community, the repository was not free to us. And we had to somehow kind of get the cost of that integrated into our own set of bills. Now, it turns out when you think about the economics of data stewardship, big data is sort of our big buzzword, and for those of us in the data world, we're thrilled to be riding the big data wave, but the fact is, not all data is big, and some of your most interesting data requires managing not because of its size. So if you think about locally manageable data, say data that fits on your hard drive, for which if your hard drive crashes, at the end it's kind of okay with you, that's something you can kind of absorb into your existing costs. But if you think about other kinds of things you might want to do with data that's valuable to you, if it's big, you need more than your hard drive. Mike Norman has 200, 300, perhaps it's more, terabytes of data over at SDSC. He's not going to put that on his hard drive. He can't. If it needs to be coupled with data services, mining, you have certain kinds of analysis algorithms that you want to do. If it has to be long-lived. So your data is not just around for this year, it's around for 5, 10, 50, 100 years. What do? You have to keep migrating it forward with new generations of media. Perhaps it's like the protein data bank and you want to make it available to everyone. Perhaps it's HIPAA-compliant data and you want to make it available to only a small number of people. So you need policy on top of that and fault tolerance in your data infrastructure. So all of these things cost money. And if you go out past your locally manageable data, you need to deal with the economics. Now that's something we've been dealing with in the data community for a long time. But we're starting to see big national entities get involved in that. And so, recently, in fact, on February 22nd of this year, we got a memo, the agencies with $100 million or more of R&D funds got a memo from John Holdren, the science advisor, saying they wanted to make the products of federal research grants to be accessible to the public. And of course, the New York Times followed it up a couple of days later saying, we paid for the research, so let's see it. Well, the fact is that in Holdren's memo, he said no new money. So the agencies are really being asked to identify resources within their existing budgets. And as we've seen in the previous slides, these things cost money. So where does that money come from? Well, the discussion has been going on, and the agencies prepared their plans. Those plans were due in September. And of course, this is a subject that's dear to my and others' heart. So I asked Vince Cerf if he would co-author with me an op-ed that we published in Science in last August. And so this was the op-ed, Who Will Pay for Public Access to Research Data? And what we did was we talked about sort of 4 different activities that where one could kind of distribute the costs. So it's not all the government paying for it, it's not all Google paying for it, et cetera. And I'll talk about those in the next one. But I couldn't resist, even though it's not PG, adding my favorite tweet about this that somebody sent, because it turned out that if you wanted to read our article, you had to be able to subscribe to Science or get that article separately. So it turns out that it costs you $20 to read our article on public access data, unless you know, which now you do, I'm letting you in on the secret, that the only free link comes off my website. So if you want to read this, go over to my website and do it. But, and actually, I think we got the Irony Award from someone or another for, irony of talking about public access. But this is part of the problem. There's a lot of really important stuff in Science and Nature and our other kinds of publications that you want to read in less than a year or whatever it is that they release it to the public. And we have to figure out a way to do it, and publishers are struggling with that because they need a business model. And their business model is charging us subscription fees, like other magazines do. So this is something that everyone's dealing with. Let me just tell you very briefly the things we suggest in the article in case it's of interest. First of all, the idea is that you cannot absorb this all within one sector. You can't. No one's going to stand up, and no one can do it. But everybody can do their part, so we can actually have a whole spectrum of stewardship options for the very important publicly accessible research data. Private sector, the Googles, the Amazons, et cetera, can be incentivized to keep public access research data in the same way they have incentives to do other things that are socially valuable. If you're in West Virginia, you get a tax credit for sponsoring the ballet and doing other kinds of things in the public good. Storing research data in the public good is something that, for example, we could extend those kind of laws for. I'm very delighted for you all and sort of proud for us all that Christine Alvarado, who's a new member of the department, just got a very prestigious award at the Grace Hopper Conference, which had 4,800 fabulous technical women there last week for the changes she made in the computer science culture at Harvey Mudd, that I know she's going to be doing fabulous things here as well. If you look at the Grace Hopper program, you see a lot of people sponsoring that under the same set of kinds of incentives, their reputation for the public good, et cetera. So the private sector can stand up and really help us out in this using the same kinds of mechanisms that they use for social impact stuff already. In the public sector, the government does sponsor some data. Protein Data Bank has a consortium of people. There are other kinds of data collections like the Alzheimer's and the autism that are supported by the public sector. What they can do is help clarify what they're not going to support. So they can help create the business model because they're not going to support everything. If they're clear about which things are valuable and how do you get to be one of those data collections and what that pathway is, that's something that would help the whole community. In the academic sector, there are some very, very progressive libraries like the UCSD libraries who can start catching this. But if you say use your budget tomorrow or Monday morning, they cannot do it. If you say in 5 years from now, it should be part of kind of the institutional bills of UCSD. It should step forward. Maybe I'll have some donors, philanthropy. But meanwhile, some of the agencies will help you by, dare I say the word stimulus, giving you kind of a jump start to develop capacity and develop a workforce. And then you have to step up and develop a sustainable business model. Libraries can do that. And if we help them out, they can kind of like step into that. And finally, and this turned out to be the most provocative of any of the suggestions in the op-ed, research community itself can pay. In our real lives, I donate to Wikipedia, I have a backup service for my Gmail, I download iTunes. All of those require me to pay some small amount. So imagine that, and then of course we see advertisements, often annoying, all the time. And so imagine that you went over to the National Virtual Observatory and saw to see astronomy data, and you saw some annoying telescope advertisement. Or imagine that you went over to the protein data bank and it charged you 99 cents per hit, like iTunes might. So this is something the academic community has not been happy about. But if you think about the techniques that work in the real world, at some point, because this data is so valuable to us, we might start seeing this in the academic world. Okay, enough about academics. At each section of this talk, and this is the end of the first section, and there'll be 2 sections in case you're counting, I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the frontier challenges. And for us in the data world, when we start thinking about research, data sharing, infrastructure, obviously both in the academic sector, the public sector, and the private sector, we're really getting a handle on how do you keep it, how do you sustain it at absolutely huge amounts. Think about the data that Google has, or Amazon, or eBay, et cetera. But there's things that we are really going to need going forward. So, the first thing we need to think about is data quality. How do I know if something I find on the internet is credible? Is it clean data? Is it accurate? Did someone interpolate it and make some mistakes about it? We've all heard horror stories about people who, thought they were measuring in inches and the data was in centimeters and, things got messed up. So, how do we have any kind of data quality? The second thing, and we're going to need a lot of infrastructure to help us make those kinds of decisions. The second thing we need to think about is data compatibility. So now I've got data from different places. I'm going to look at this asthma question. Are you more likely to get asthma in Mexico City as you are in Los Angeles? And I want to put data from different data collections together, but how can I ensure that they're compatible in some way? Well, if you go to the pharmacy, and the pharmacist has been dealing with you for a while, there's a whole drug compatibility thing. So, Dr. A gives you one medication, Dr. B gives you another medication. By the way, what you don't want to do is die because those 2 medications don't combine together. How can we do that in the data world? What this means is over the next decade or 2, we're going to have to get serious about, you always see the data to information to knowledge. When you have data and you add meaning to it, you get information. We need to have some literacy about it. How do I know if the data I'm reading in the newspaper and is being used as evidence for particular kinds of issues, how do I know if that's a legitimate use of that data, or if it's even good data? And in some sense, we want our systems to start helping us make those decisions. And then finally, and I had the great privilege of chairing a data catalog workshop at NIH that Shankar Subramaniam and Marianne Martone and a bunch of other people from UCSD came to. The question is, how do you find relevant data? And we used to talk about data catalogs as if we could do some whole earth catalog for data. But the fact is, there's a huge amount of it out there. If you think about the Internet of Things, there's the Internet of Data. How do you find it all? And so these days what we do is we have advanced search tools, but those search tools are going to have to be really quite large. The data should be discoverable by both people and machines. We might want targeted discovery. So if I'm a chemist and I'm worrying about chemistry databases for a particular kind of way, I want to target in a particular way. So these are real challenges for us as we develop infrastructure and algorithms and physical infrastructure and all of that going forward. Okay, so what I'd like to do is spend a little time talking about community engagement. So I said we were going to talk about the social infrastructure. Social infrastructure includes things like economics and politics and standards, but it also includes communities. And this is a picture from the second plenary from the Research Data Alliance. I'll be talking about that in a little bit. This is a new group that I've been very involved in. It's sort of just come about in the last year and a half. It went from 8 people from 5 countries to now has 1,300 members from 53 countries, including the Vatican, which is pretty interesting. So I'll talk about that in a little bit. But let's just start with why communities matter. And it turns out that at some point, you run out of headroom when you're trying to do something yourself, in your project, or at your institution, or perhaps even in your nation. You need to couple with other people in order to get things done. Now, that's often messy, it's often political, it's certainly imperfect, but it gets you somewhere you haven't gone before. So for those of us in computer science, we might remember the MPI forum. So Message Passing Interface Forum, and it turned out that long time ago when some of us were starting our careers and dinosaurs were roaming the earth, there were the first parallel computers. In fact, it was true that people were looking at different kinds of communication protocols. And, but what you got was kind of different kinds of protocols that made it hard to create algorithms. You really couldn't sort of create, these nascent compilers. And it turned out that a group of people headed up by Jack Dangara and others came together in the MPI forum and created MPI. And it looked at a number of different communication, it included a number of different communication protocols. It wasn't everything, it wasn't perfect. But people were able to agree on it. They created a reference implementation of it. And in fact, since that time, people were able to create compilers that use those protocols. They were able to create algorithms that use those protocols. Is this the way we're going to program exascale machines? Probably not. Was it perfect? Certainly not. But the fact is it moved the community forward. That was true with the IETF and the internet. So people came together to agree on sets of standards around the internet. Weren't perfect. Privacy was, a big problem, and security was a big problem. But it enabled us to do the really amazing things that we're now evolving now. And it's certainly true in healthcare, too. Oftentimes in the health sciences, it's your competitive advantage to keep your data in your lab and not share it with anyone else. When NIH made the policies that said, if you take our money, you have to deposit it in a common data collection, that it really made a difference. So this is especially true in the Alzheimer's community, where now you kind of do the trends from noise kind of analysis that you often do with a much bigger patient population, so you can see much finer resolution kinds of issues. So community matters, and oftentimes community can, even perhaps clumsily so, push us forward in ways that we can't do. The other thing to sort of think about is these are not just problems in the US. Data sharing and public access is a global issue. Everywhere you look, nations and communities are trying to deal with it. They have a very serious set of efforts around data rights in the European Union. And in fact, some of our companies go over there and Google's a different thing and Facebook's a different thing because people have to deal with it. India has its own, South Africa has its own, the Australians have the Australian National Data Service, where Australian universities are sharing their data. And then you look at our global communities of librarians and archivists and repositories and museums, communities of cyber infrastructure professionals, communities of researchers, data scientists, et cetera. These are global communities. And so if you sort of couple the need for a community to really solve certain kinds of problems and the fact that those communities are global, and then you apply them to the data infrastructure problem, you'll kind of see where the Research Data Alliance was motivated. So this was the organization I referred to. This has been, in the last year and a half, a global community-driven organization. It was launched in Gothenburg, Sweden last March, and the purpose of it is to do two things. First of all, to reduce, to put in the social, organizational, and technical infrastructure to, number one, reduce the barriers to data sharing and exchange, and number two, accelerate the development of global data, coordinated data infrastructure, and that's used for data-driven innovation. So what does that mean exactly? So RDA is a community of 1,300 plus people. They're building infrastructure. That infrastructure is supposed to support data sharing and exchange. And they're doing all of those, or not all of those, but they're doing many of those building blocks that I showed on a slide earlier. They're looking at harmonized standards and data access and preservation policy and practice, et cetera. And let me sort of share kind of the approach the RDA, Research Data Alliance, has done. So if I want to solve the following problem, I want to go to a hotel room in any country in the world and read my email. What do I do? So, I go there, am I going to wait for all of the different plug manufacturers to, figure out what is the universal plug, what's its shape, its size, its color, everybody's going to agree on this plug, then they're going to implement it. No, I have my little bag of plug adapters. And that means if they don't have my shape plug, I put one of these on and then I can read my email. It's not really about the plugs at all. It's about me reading my email. It's also true that, so in some sense, all you need to do is harmonize the standards that exist, and that'll just give you a foothold in the mountains so you can kind of keep climbing. The idea is not to, do the tram that everybody will get on. You just need a foothold so you can move forward. That's also true of policy and practice. If I go to Disneyland, those rides are not made, take a roller coaster or any ride, it's not made for everybody from 0 to 100 feet high. It's made, for people within a certain, interval so that they can ride it. So some of these rides are actually unsafe if you're too short, if you're a child or Fran or something like that. So the idea is that, oftentimes we put in policy and practice that work for a constituency, but not everybody. And that's the whole point of the Research Data Alliance. Let's create stuff, let's have people use stuff, and then let's move on. And if it doesn't turn out to be the stuff we use 5 years from now or 10 years from now, that's okay. So it turns out that this has been a pretty appealing approach for a lot of people. So the idea is that each of the working groups in Research Data Alliance, there has to be somebody who's going to use it, who needs it to share and exchange data. And so those people need to be in the group. And then the people who are creating the infrastructure need to be in the group, and the people who are adopting the infrastructure need to be in the group. So it's like a tiger team. So, typically that's not stuff we have to do a lot of research on. It's something that's kind of harvestable, where the infrastructure will complement the kind of computer science research that we do and the kind of domain research that we do. It's efforts that have applicability to someone, perhaps not everyone, and it's efforts that we can use now. We have two kinds of groups in RDA. We have working groups who are actually creating the infrastructure and interest groups who are really thinking about what kind of infrastructure do I need. For example, an agricultural interoperability group who is really looking at agricultural productivity. They want to combine germplasm data. They want to combine weather data. They want to combine terrestrial data. They have specific sets of questions they want to solve. How do you combine data to do that? This gives you a sense about the groups we've got so far. In less than a year, there's been 30 groups, and it's grown precipitously. The red ones are ones that are mostly domain-driven, so they're starting with the question. The green ones are the ones that are looking at policy and practice around a certain set of questions. And the blue ones are ones that have specific infrastructure targets that are going to be used by someone within the group. RDA was also host to a bunch of other data organizations who are really interested in finding a neutral place to come to some common agenda around data citation. So it's sort of like a town square that RDA is starting to do. I thought you might be interested in the number of the community from RDA. Right now we have about 2/3 academics, about 1/3 split between private and public, and a wide variety of people from almost all continents. So just a couple more things. How have people gotten involved? The plenaries are twice a year. We started in Sweden. We had it at the National Academy of Science last September. We hosted about 400 people. The meetings are working meetings, so we have people come and talk to us about trends in the data environments, and then we spend at least 50% of our time working because it's a global community. It's hard for people to meet face-to-face. And then we're starting to have these summits for other kinds of organizations. If you're interested, talk to me afterwards. The next two plenaries are going to be in Ireland, and then the Netherlands will be back in the US the year after that, and we're looking for a place to host it. People have mentioned San Diego as a possibility. So just on the horizon for RDA, the ultimate goal, again, is not to boil the data ocean. There's hundreds and thousands of things going on in this community. We are not doing all of them, but we are doing one thing, and we hope to do it very well. And that's to accelerate data sharing through the development of infrastructure that people can use now. So on the horizon, when you think about our metrics of success, we want to create a pipeline of adopted infrastructure that people can actually use. We want to build the regional communities. Here in the US, there's huge interest in data. And if you look at, the White House has two separate individuals looking at big data, looking at public access, and more. So there's lots of ways for us to play. And then, of course, the idea is to build an effective organization that supports what you all do, what the data community does. So Let me talk a little bit get back to the notion of ecosystems. Remember, we talked about ecosystems, and we talked about there being natural resources and infrastructure and resource management. And the fact is that, all of our ecosystems live in the context of other ecosystems. So I can think about the natural world ecosystem, but there's an ocean ecosystem and an urban ecosystem and, a space ecosystem. And so the idea is that all of these ecosystems actually have to work together. There has to be some sort of coordination between them. So when you think about the frontier challenges in this area, it turns out that we have to figure out how to coordinate all these different ecosystems and all these different data cultures. And each of them have different kinds of community reward and collaboration competition structures. They all have their own kinds of policy and practice. They may be subject to national or international regulation. And when you think about it, we're starting to see a lot of kind of like clashes between different ecosystems. So if you think about it, the European Union has, roughly 500 million plus people, who are citizens of the EU. Facebook has over 1 billion users. And so right now you think, what are the entities in, think about a data UN. Imagine you created a data UN. Who are the countries in that? Well, is Facebook a country? Is the European Union a country? Is the global set of chemists a country? And so you're starting to see a lot of crossover between sort of traditional communities, traditional ecosystems, et cetera. The FDA now wants to regulate some apps because those apps are medical devices. Now I can use my cell phone as a medical device. When I start thinking about the Internet of Things, that has as part of it the Internet of Data. So how do I start thinking about the Internet of Data? So what we want to do for these ecosystems is we want to do the things we always want to do. We want to resolve conflicts. We want to help all these entities work together in a reasonable way. We want to think about ecosystem management and sustainability and stewardship and all of those kinds of things. And when you think about, you don't even know who the players are, much less how to do the governance. This is really going to be a set of incredibly important issues for us to be thinking about. Let me say that you think like, well, so how are we going to even go about this? It's just too big. But if you think about how the UN started approaching sustainable environment, it's just sort of interesting to kind of look at it. And it turns out that the UN has put together a number of different commissions. When they started looking at a sustainable environment, what the Brundtland Commission did in an interesting report called Our Common Future is it identified 4 key components. Those components were ecological sustainability, so you can think of that as sustainability of our data collections, our systems, our infrastructure. Cultural and institutional sustainability, who are our institutions? Is Facebook our institution? Is UCSD our institution? Is the US our institution? And to really talk about those cultures. Economic sustainability, data without a home means data that you can't access and that's gone. So that's a really important thing for us to think about. And then political sustainability. If you think about the wherewithal to take these policies, to take these kinds of ideas and carry them forward, you need stakeholders and you need sort of powerful advocates to do that. Not surprisingly, they said a holistic solution is important. So, education, debate, public participation. But the fact is, it's like Margaret Mead said, it just starts with us. There's only a few people who can really make anything, now I'm misquoting it, but there's only a few people and really it starts with individual participation. So with that, I would like to say, all of us can be involved in this. And it's perhaps one of the most important things in our generation and in our century to be involved with. And we can do it from a lot of different things, but we have to do it in some sort of holistic way. Because otherwise we won't be able to maximize the potential of the information age, which is a thrilling place to live. So with that, I would like to wish CSE a tremendously wonderful anniversary and 25 great next years, and thank you all for asking me.
So we have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions real quick. I don't know if we have any submitted questions or not.
Oh, cool.
All right. So the question reads, there you go. Academic publish, many open source models are available, yet people prefer to publish in prestigious venues like Science or Nature. How can we reconcile?
This is a great question because the open access memo from February 22nd dealt with two things. It dealt with publications and it dealt with data. And the publishers themselves are trying hard to kind of figure out what's an evolutionary business model for them because, of course, if there's some expectation that things will be in the public domain for free, they have to deal with it. I was recently at the NIH workshop that I just talked about, and there was someone from the White House who had actually authored the public access memo, and we had talked, we're starting to talk about a pilot where publications, high-profile publications such as one of these, and can couple with repositories and the community to start making available at least the data that's associated with research publications. Now, typically we think about the data as a graph in the PDF file, but if you think about it, we all pull up, or many of us pull up the New York Times on our iPhones, and any publication that we do will start becoming at least as exciting as a New York Times article. There'll be movies, there'll be audio, there'll be links, there'll be all kinds of things that need to be kept live. So the problem of coupling your Science or your Nature or your CACM or your whatever article with its data and making that data available and putting a business model behind it is a current right now problem that there are a lot of people sort of thinking about different things to come. And I have to say for this particular pilot, there's some really exciting things on the horizon, including some private sector companies who might be willing to kind of step up and do some data hosting for the community. So this is a sort of a stay tuned thing. But, and it's an excellent question because it's really important.
All righty, we'll thank the speaker again. Thank you.